What's up, YouTube? This is the 82 and 0 podcast. Continuing on. I want to get into a topic that's been coming on my mind these past couple days. Um, there's a criticism I hear a lot of the time when people are talking about the 1950s, 60s, 70s era of basketball, where they say there were less teams back then. Uh, okay, here's my point I want to make. Okay, I agree, and I'm mostly talking from my previous video I did where I was talking about the JJ Redick versus Mad Dog Russo debate. Redick says there were only 8 teams uh, back in Bob Cousy's day, and there was 2 rounds. So what I want to say is, I think the 2-round argument might be a more valid criticism of that era. Indeed. But here's one thing I want to, because you look at like the 1957 NBA Finals, for example. The Celtics only had 2 rounds. That's it to win it. And one thing I want to point out, I don't necessarily agree that having 8 teams means that the NBA was weaker back then. And let me make my case. So, if you look at the league today, right? And even 22 years ago, right? The early 2000s. There's a lot of bad expansion teams. I know the Magic have had stretches where they've been good, but for the most part, they've been bad. You've had, look at bad teams like the Kings that just stay bad. Or you have teams like the Timberwolves. Although they're good this year, they're not, they had like 15 years of missing the playoffs. Or other teams, like the Grizzlies. You get what I'm saying, though. There's a lot of really bad expansion teams that are stuck in mediocrity at best because if they're bad, they get a player, they get a first-round draft pick, right? But the problem with this is people don't want to play in these small markets, so they leave. And this is why teams like the Pelicans are never able to build a championship contender. Because Chris Paul will leave, Anthony Davis will leave. Now Zion is saying he wants to leave. So, my point I'm trying to make is, what if there's 30 teams right now, right? And you can do this simulation on 2K22 if you want. See what I'm talking about. But anyways, you take the league, 30 teams, right? And you delete all of the teams except the 8 best teams, right? Then there's a dispersal draft with the remaining players. Do you get what I'm saying? This is why teams in the early days, I don't mean like the early days, but more so like the 50s and 60s. They were really deep. Like if you ever look up like the Celtics, for example, they'd have 7 or 8 Hall of Famers. Or the St. Louis Hawks of the early 60s had multiple Hall of Famers. Or the Lakers had multiple Hall of Famers. The Knicks, even though the Knicks were really bad in the early 60s, they had a lot of Hall of Famers. So, do you get what I'm saying? And the first time I ever heard this argument was there was a debate between Michael Jordan and Bill Russell, where Jordan said, my era is tougher. There was only 8 teams in your era. And Bill Russell responded by saying, and this was after the 93 finals, I want to say. And Russell responded by saying, that's right, there were only 8 teams, but that meant the best of the best would only get the job. And you wouldn't have won a championship last year. And Jordan goes, what do you mean? Because he goes, John Paxson, who hit that game winner for you, wouldn't have been in the league. And so that got me thinking, And when you start going back and looking at a lot of these early teams, like if you go look at season summaries, like in the late 50s, throughout the 60s, you don't see... I know there were bad teams, obviously. There's going to be a team that's not going to be good. But what I mean by they were bad back then is a bad record back then would be like 34 wins. And that's like a horrible, atrocious record. And teams that were super teams back then weren't winning games like they do today. There weren't teams winning 65, 63 games. Yes, you had the Celtics. I think it was in 64 or 65. They won 62 games. But other than that, they in 57 they were a 44 win team, 58 they were 49, 52 win in 59, and 57 win team in 61, and 60 win team in 62, 58 and 63. So do you understand what I'm saying? Like, the league had a lot more parity, I want to say, as far as stars. Now, it'd be more so true, yes, because the Celtics were always winning, and this is because the free agency. But when you get into like the 70s, right? Move past the 60s, right? There was never a team in the NBA that repeated in the 1970s. It was a decade of parity. And there would be teams that would win 49 games and win the championship. So this is why I don't like this argument. Oh, there were less teams back then, so the quality was worse. Because I'm just going to use 1972 as an example, right? The year the Lakers won. There were 17 teams that year, And even though this Lakers team was like a superpower, there were still a lot of good teams to challenge them. You had the Bucks, the Knicks, the Celtics. The Bulls were pretty good. The Suns were pretty good. So, and bad teams back then, like, for example, the Baltimore Bullets were like a 38-win team. So that's just the point I want to make. Teams were a lot more stacked back then. I don't know if that's necessarily a valid criticism of that era. And so that's my thoughts. But I also want to mention, if it's not as competitive as everyone makes it out to be, how come, like, for example, the Boston Celtics in the 60s had so many Game 7s? Bill Russell at one point played in the most Game 7s in NBA history. I think Ray Allen broke his record, but, if it's so uncompetitive back then and so Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain are just levels and levels beyond everyone else. Yes, they were the best players back then, but come on. I think there's a lot of lies about the competition back then, because Russell was in so many Game 7s, and if this was such a weak era and they were such a great team, why didn't they just steamroll over everyone? They won by the skin of their teeth a lot, especially in 69, So I don't necessarily believe this notion that less teams means less competition. It just meant the teams were more stacked. Because if you only have 8 teams, there's a lot of good players that are going to get cut. A lot of good players who aren't going to make it. So that's my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think down below. Thanks for watching.
I can feel you.